All right. Cool. Um, so we're gonna start out with my James Baldwin quote. So it's going to kind of good way to kind of set set the intention of the class. James Baldwin says, "Whiteness is a dangerous concept. It's not about skin color. It's not even about race. It's about willful blindness used to justify white supremacy. It's about using moral rhetoric to defend exploitation, racism, mass murder, reigns of terror, and crimes of an empire." So hopefully, we're going to kind of dive into whiteness, and hopefully everyone's on the same board. We're not going to necessarily, not whiteness pertaining to skin color, but whiteness that this status of privilege that we created called whiteness. We're going to kind of explore the history, how it was created, explore the culture of it, how the privileges it has, that it affords. And then we'll probably end somewhere in the middle of the class, and I'll do what I did last class and just record the last couple sections. But we're going to talk about color blindness and how that is a privilege, white savior complex, talk about white lash. And then the last section is really great. I mean, I guarantee we're probably not going to get to that, but I definitely recommend, check this out. We're going to talk about how we center whiteness when we're having conversations about race, and a lot of times we do this white centering thing where we put our emotions, like we value our emotions above Black experiences, and with racism, and how we kind of center these conversations and derail the important work that needs to happen. So, cool. All right. So I'm going to start off with a video from Eddie Glaude. Eddie Glaude is awesome. I'm spacing the school, but he's this awesome professor. He's been doing a lot of really great speeches lately. So he gave this speech right after the El Paso shooting in 2019, which that was down a person. A white supremacist went into like a Walmart and specifically to start shooting migrants of color, Latinx migrants. So this is like the day after. I mean, he comments about this. And if anyone can't hear this video, just type it down in the text box. Thanks.
America's not unique in its sins. As a country, we're not unique in our evils. To be honest with you. I think where we may be singular is our refusal to acknowledge them, and the legends and myths we tell about our inherent, goodness to hide and cover and conceal, so that we can maintain a kind of willful ignorance that protects our innocence. See, the thing is that when the Tea Party was happening, we were saying, pundits, oh, it's just about economic populism. It's not about race. When people knew, social scientists were already writing that what was driving the Tea Party were anxieties about demographic shifts, that the country was changing, that they were seeing these racially ambiguous babies on Cheerios commercials, that the country wasn't quite feeling like it was a white nation anymore. And people were screaming from the top of their lungs, this is not just simply economic populism. This is the ugly underbelly of the country. See, the thing is this, and I'll say this, and I'll take the hit on it. There are communities that have had to bear the brunt of white Americans confronting the danger of their innocence. And it happens every generation. So somehow we have to kind of, oh my God, is this who we are? And just again, here's another generation of babies. Think about it. A 2-year-old had his bones broken by 2 parents trying to shield him from being killed. A woman who has been married to this man for as long as I've been on the planet almost, lost her husband. For what? And so what we know is that the country has been playing politics for a long time on this hatred. We know this. So it's easy for us to place it all on Donald Trump's shoulders. It's easy for us to place Pittsburgh on his shoulders. It's easy for me to place Charlottesville on his shoulders. It's easy for us to place El Paso on his shoulders. This is us. And if we're going to get past this, we can't blame it on him. He's a manifestation of the ugliness that's in us. had the privilege of growing up in a tradition that didn't believe in the myths and the legends because we had to bear the brunt of them. Either we're going to change, Nicole, or we're going to do this again and again, and babies are going to have to grow up without mothers and fathers, uncles and aunts, friends, while we're trying to convince white folk to finally leave behind a history that will maybe, or embrace a history that might set them free from being white. Finally.
Right. So that inline, if you remember on that James Baldwin video that we played last time, talking where that ended with the idea of just asking, what one begs American people is just to accept our history. So, when the time comes, we could build a new identity. And when we talk about building new identities, again, we're not talking about a post-racial thing. We're not talking, we're talking about getting, building an identity beyond, this whiteness that Eddie Glaude was talking about, and not just ignoring it, but dismantling the systems that create it. So when we think about, what kind of systems, what it means, there's a really great podcast. I don't know if anyone's checked it out yet. Seeing White is really phenomenal. Phenomenal. It's got a whole season of different, episodes just based on exploring, what it means, to be white. And it was really, really powerful. So I definitely recommend it. But this is actually just like an advertisement for it. But they play a couple clips of what it means, whiteness means, a couple lines, and we're going about to dive into. So I'm just going to play this.
So it's fair to say literally that slave traders commissioned the invention of this sort of codified racist idea of black people and implicitly then, on the other hand, of white people.
Yes.
It's important that we see this creation was for the upliftment of white people, primarily the white people at the top.
If you had a long skull and you were light-skinned, that was good. And then if you had a long skull but you were dark-skinned, that was not good.
Dina goes on this way, ticking off government benefits set aside for white people.
So was this country built on affirmative action for white people?
I don't know what that means about trying to salvage the idea of like good whiteness.
Right.
When was whiteness good?
It is all about power. It is not prejudice. It is not racial prejudice. It is not bigotry. It is power.
All right. Nice little ending. Yeah, I definitely recommend this is a fantastic podcast to watch. And I'm having trouble getting into the whole podcast thing, and I just enjoyed this. But yeah, they talked about several different things of not only like how whiteness was created, and we're about to dive into that history in the next chapter, but also how it's still being perpetuated, and how like it showed the picture of the veterans in a train, and that was to kind of signal that there was all these benefits from the New Deal to the GI Bill that were only for people that qualified for this white status. So it wasn't just about the creation of it wasn't just about slavery, but it's like our whole entire country and how it's like kind of stayed the same. So yeah, before so next chapter, I just want to dive into the kind of like the creation and the history of white. But I wanted to see, maybe pause for a second, see if there was anything specific that really struck out on all those last two videos, or anything that anybody wants to kind of comment on. And at these times, you can unmute yourself, or you can type into the text box as well. All right. Well, we can keep on. Yeah, feel free. If it comes to mind or something, yeah, definitely. You can type in anytime, or even after this presentation. I'm happy to have discussion sessions as well. All right, so the idea of whiteness. So again, hopefully we're understanding that this isn't, we're not about to, talk about skin color. We're talking about, statuses and hierarchies and things like that. And there's a really great quote, the Food Solutions New England. People in the food justice world might know this. They did like a 21-day food justice challenge where every day you learn some lesson about racism and anti-blackness and whiteness, and then how it incorporates into food systems. But really, another really great thing, a cool thing to do that doesn't take much time each day. It's like they're like little mini lessons. But I really like this quote. And as we consider whiteness, it is important to realize that it was created, defined, and continues to be perpetuated in opposition to something else, blackness. And that's important to understand that, we'll dive deep into the histories, but blackness, essentially, black was created by Portuguese as they were setting up their transatlantic slave system, and they were exporting black, and enslaving black people and exporting them, African people, to exporting them to the new world. And it was just such a brutal system that they needed to kind of justify it. So they actually created this idea that, all Africans were part of this black species, a subspecies, and a very uncivilized, inferior people that, and it was okay to enslave them because they were actually bringing in civilization and Christianity and things like that. And then, that spread all over, but it wasn't until the 1700s that we created this idea of white, and that was in Virginia with the colonial government. They're looking for a way to divide, the poor black, and the poor white workers, the aristocratic governments, and they created this idea of whiteness as a privileged status, while they're, creating slave codes and taking away rights of black people as a way to kind of divide and conquer. So it's important to understand that, whiteness and black, was created in direct opposition of blackness. Whiteness is a status of basically saying that it's a group of people that aren't defined as black, and so they get other rights. And to kind of before we dive into history, I want to talk just a little bit about the difference between ethnicity versus race. So ethnicity, and there's a lot, there's a lot of different perspectives and stuff. So if I miss anything, feel free to chime in. But ethnicity is more about like having a shared past with a group of people, a common ancestry, common traditions, languages, culture. It's about a group of people that have been together through different, time periods and geographies and stuff. And so that was like the early slave systems were based on, it may have been more based on ethnicity. There wasn't a concept of race like back in the Greek times and ancient times. But race, as we were just saying, race is something it was very new, very, somewhat new concept that we created black in the 1400s and white in the 1700s. And it was based on false classifications. It's based on a lie. It's basically based on this presumption that, people with different skin colors were different species of people and were inferior, and there was a racial hierarchy with white on top and black on the bottom. And a lot of people, a lot of white people will run with this sometimes and say, "Oh, well, race is a social construct; it's made up." So, I don't know. I'm sure people have heard these people on the comment threads about how if you talk about race, you're just dividing people because it's a made-up concept and it was made up to divide people. And yeah, way back then it was, but the racism that was created from that, from creating these made up ideas of race that has been around for the last 400 years and still around today, that is very, very real. So that, even though race is a social construct, racism is definitely very real, and it's something that we need to take very seriously. And at the same time, even though race was made up concept, a lot of people, a lot of races have kind of moved beyond that and created their own culture from this idea of race. Like black culture, is a beautiful culture of like resiliency, not because of white supremacy, but in spite of white supremacy. And same with Latinx and indigenous, they have moved beyond and kind of like, created, these cultures. But then when you look at, white culture has never really moved beyond the intentions of why it was created as a legal status of privilege. I'll give you an example of this. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the Racial Equity Institute. They're called REI. It's really confusing if you're into outdoor sports, not the REI that you buy sports equipment or whatever, camping stuff, but it's Racial Equity Institute. They're from North Carolina, but they do these amazing 2-day, anti-racism workshops all throughout the country. You have to like host them, and Montgomery County hosts them every once in a while. I definitely recommend like write that down, REI, and like get on their mailing list because it's such a worthwhile 2-day seminar. I was doing that, actually right before COVID hit, and there was like a exercise that we were doing where they divided all of us into different groups of people, different races, and then they asked everyone to write down, one thing that you've, valued or grateful about your race. And then we all wrote it up on the board, and the white people went first, and and they do this like, all over the country, and everyone, it's all the same results every time, all the white people, including myself, like I wrote, I'm grateful that my children don't have to experience racism. And then other people wrote, I'm grateful that I don't have to, experience police brutality. I'm grateful that I'm not, followed around in stores. I'm grateful, for all these, it was all based on our privileges. And then it got to, Black people in the Black group, they were grateful for, they were, grateful about, how resilient Black culture is, how beautiful it is. They're grateful for their traditions and all, like the communities and their families. And same with Latinx, it was like, they're grateful for all these beautiful things about their culture and the indigenous, so it's like everyone's kind of moved beyond this, like, this fake idea of race. We build something, on it, but white people, we are still at the same starting point that our race is just a cult. Our culture is privilege, and that's not to say. And you can still have ethnicity. There was people that were Irish and Jewish and things like that. That they had a lot of value on that. But when it just came to pure whiteness, like no one could really move beyond that. What it was basically just privilege. So found that to be pretty powerful. And if you ever take that webinar, I feel bad, if you ever take that class, pretend like I didn't tell you what was happening and just go along with the exercise. But I'm going to play a quick video from Vox about the myth of race.
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled Black and decided were fundamentally different. But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you were of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the U.S. needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be Black once varied so wildly throughout the country, from 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous 1 drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then suddenly in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey. The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was Black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent, but the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as where your ancestors came from, or the experiences of people who may have been put in the same racial group as you. Dorothy Roberts explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which include some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa. It's not actually about race at all. This, of course, does not mean that the concept of race isn't hugely important in our lives. The racial categories to which we're assigned can determine real-life experiences, they can drive political outcomes, and they can even make the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up can give us an important perspective on where racism came from in the first place.
All right, so Amanda just posted some really great notes on that seeing white. So she posted, race is man-made. It is not biological. Nature did not make it. It is man-made. Race is a social constructed. People constructed race with a particular agenda in mind. Whiteness and white supremacy were invented to justify slavery and extension other forms of exploitation. The story of race is a story of labor, for sure. Our first class next month, we're going to dive into the rise of capitalism and these systems of that based on making as much wealth as possible by exploiting labor, and how that transformed into a lot of the systems that we have now, for sure. Thank you. All right, so it's kind of let's start back on the kind of beginning, and we're just going to kind of walk through the construction of our racial systems. So, like as we said, like in the ancient world, like in Greek world, they definitely categorize people by geography, by ethnic and cultural and religious identities, but the idea of actually categorizing people by the skin color just was not a thing. Ibram Kendi writes, ethnic and religious and color prejudice existed in the ancient world. Construction of races, white Europe, black Africa, for instance, did not. And the first concept of race really came about in the mid 1400s with Portugal. So Portugal, so Europe, was it was big in the slave trade for a long time before this. But majority of the slaves that or the enslaved people that they got, and a lot of the other world got too, came from Eastern European people, specifically Slavic people. Actually, the word slave is derived from Slav, or a person of Slavic descent, and so they were repeatedly raided and conquered and enslaved. But eventually, they started constructing, better fortifications, forts. They got their, they got their defenses up. So it became harder and harder to actually enslave those people. So Portugal was looking for another, source of slaves, particularly since they were, starting to, starting their colonization and looking towards America and to set up colonies, and the people they were trying to enslave in America, and indigenous populations, it wasn't working out very well, and they were basically, committing genocide over there. So they needed new labor to create that wealth. So they started looking towards Africa, and they started setting up, African slave systems. Or they started setting up the transatlantic slave trade, which is basically they would buy people from Africa and then ship them to America. But again, like I was saying, this was such a brutal system. Millions of people, millions of people died just on the way to Americas, and let alone once they got there. So they really, so the prince at the time, Prince Henry, who was running all this, he really wanted to kind of glorify what they were doing and kind of paint a better image. So he hired this writer called Gomez de Zura to basically go to Africa, to where they were setting up these creating these slave trades, and to kind of glorify what they're doing. So so he did two things. One is he commented about how Africa, Portugal was on a mission to bring civilization and Christianity and all these things to Africa. At the same time, he also came up, he created these stereotypes and these myths about the people living in Africa. One is he assumed, his idea that all African people of all nations was one species of people, and they were like inferior. They were savages. They were beast-like, as he mentions a lot, and so they were all part of this black species of subhuman people who were uncivilized. And again, Portugal was bringing these people, they were doing them a favor by bringing them civilization and Christianity and all these other things. So that kind of whitewashed this idea and turned it into like this, great. So the original, they originally, we talked about this last week too. Like the original point of this wasn't that Portugal started out as this racist group that just hated black people. Really, they wanted to cover up the fact that they were making an enormous amount of wealth off of enslavement and genocide and ethnic cleansing. So and that eventually spread. Portugal was the first country to get into the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. But eventually, there was a Dutch trade, England, France, all these other countries came, and this idea of black inferior people, was spread all over Europe to kind of help justify their slave trade, their involvement, and eventually that was brought to America as well. And at the same time that this like anti-black, stereotypes were emerging, we also saw a lot of emergence in the 1400s of anti-indigenous, stereotypes, and that came from a series of Catholic doctrines, where this idea is multiple Catholic doctrines. The biggest one being the doctrine of discovery. This was during in the 1400s, and it basically gave European Christian nations the legal authority to go colonize and discover countries, colonize and enslave the people, conquer, as long as they were bringing Christianity, as long as it was done, and they were only enslaving and killing non-Christian people. So it kind of created this idea that these indigenous people were again uncivilized, and they were doing them a favor by conquering and spreading Christianity and things like that. And we talk about like the doctrine of discovery, we talk about that like it was like a long time ago, but in reality this is still the legal precedent that one of them that we stand on, for not giving back native land to people, to native tribes. Like Thomas Jefferson used this as a legal precedent to push Western expansion and ethnic cleansing of West, tribes out West. There was even a Supreme Court case, Johnson versus McIntosh, where it's kind of a complicated case, and it was about a lot of land transfers and stuff, but the ultimate decision was that Native people, because of doctrine of discovery, Native people don't have, unless the government specifies certain reservations, all the other land was legally discovered, and so it's still so Native people don't have rights anymore. And I think that's why we sell this myth so bad that Columbus was like actually discovered this world. One is like also like whitewash the fact that there was people here before him, but also to keep on pushing this legal myth, of this legality for conquering and taking their land. And that was for most land. I mean, as we saw in Oklahoma recently, they were actually, awarded, jurisdiction back over a lot of their native land, but that was native land that was like, that was never, that was, given to people, tribes. I think a lot of it, think it was from Trail of Tears, but a lot of it was on their treaties that if they moved to this area that they had this certain land. So so that was more about just respecting these past treaties. But as opposed to all the other land that was conquered, that's what we use, not to give it back, the doctrine of discovery. So we had this emergence in 1400s of not only this anti-black racial component, but also an anti-indigenous racial component and culture being emerged and shipped all over the world. Then if we move to the Americas, so Jamestown, one of the first colonies of America, we see, 1619. Hopefully that's a familiar date with everybody, especially after last year with the awesome 1619 project that Hannah Nicole Jones did with New York Times. It's just a whole bunch of really amazing articles and podcasts. Definitely spend some time, if you haven't, reading through those articles. So the first African people came to Jamestown in 1619, and there was a lot of debate on whether they were enslaved or enslaved people, or whether they were free or indentured servants. And I think it was a mixture of some. From there, there was no laws around slavery at the time. There was no, there wasn't much rule, so a lot of times, it was kind of, people just kind of did their own thing. And so it became a mixture, after, next couple of decades, there was a mixture of free Black people, enslaved Black people, Black indentured servants, and also European indentured servants and European free people, but for the most part, because of this, this capitalistic, system of plantation system that was exported, that was just about, making as much money off of exporting land and labor. It was a very it was a very harsh system. So what you had a lot of times is you had the poor class, Black and white, or Black and European at the time, would often, kind of unite together, either run away together or resist together or even rebel together. And that really started, so that really disturbed the aristocracy government at times. So we started seeing slow, idea of like this divide and conquer, and how we're going, and which ultimately ended in the creation of this of the white status. But it really started with John Punch. He was an African indentured servant who ran away with two other indentured servants. Indentured servants are basically people who sign an agreement where they get, if they work, they get free, transportation to America from England, and then they work for 7 years or something like that. And then at the end, if you're white, you get land and things like that. I don't know if they did that for African indentured servants. And a lot of times, a lot of people, because of the rise of capitalism in Europe and in England, there was, there was so much poverty. It was created from that, that a lot, and then they criminalized, being poor. And then a lot of people, and these indentured servants were actually poor people that were, criminalized and then shipped out to England. So there was already this mentality of not, hating the class system. So when they caught John Punch and the two other white indentured servants, the white indentured servants just got a couple years added, for running away to their service. But instead, John Punch actually, to make an example of him and try to, make a wedge between him and his other fellow indentured servants, they actually gave him a lifetime of slavery was his punishment. And a lot of people will say that's like the first official slave in America. I mean, there was a lot more enslaved people before then, particularly indigenous people as well. But this was like the first legal codified enslaved person in America. So, and then eventually Elizabeth Key, 20 years later, Elizabeth Key was this woman that actually sued for her freedom. It was this enslaved woman. Because under English law, you couldn't enslave Christians. Was under English law, and a lot of that was from the Catholic doctrines. And then two, the status of the children of enslaved people, whether that child was free or enslaved, fell on the status of the father. And that's really important to understand, because that meant at that time there was much better chance that a white European or a European free person would marry and have a child with enslaved Black person or Black woman, because of patriarchy and all these things happening in white supremacy. It was a very it was a slim chance of having those rules reversed. So, but that meant that a lot of enslaved women, their children were free, and so Elizabeth Key actually sued on those grounds and actually won her freedom. But that immediately afterwards, the colonial government of Virginia, the House of Burgesses, they passed a law, one that says that now they're allowed to enslave Christians, and then two, that the status of the child is now contingent with upon the status of the mother, not the father. And that is we really need to understand the ramifications of that. One of the biggest components of parts of slavery was mass rape, and that really set this off, because not only where white and people who enslaved others, well, not only were they raping out because they could, and but also now if you raped a black woman, an enslaved black woman, that child was automatically your prophet, was automatically your new slave, because it's so that really set up this a scene for a really, really horrific just epidemic of rape, that lasted, hundreds of years. And then came the racial bribe. So this is the idea. The racial bribe is basically the ultimate divide and conquer, which basically the white aristocracy started realizing that the poor black and poor white Europeans were uniting together. So they wanted to create a divide where they wanted to get the poor white people to unite with the rich white people against the black people, and that's what they were really hoping for. And I'll read this one quote by Michelle Alexander. She wrote the new Jim Crow, which is definitely worth reading. Deliberately and strategically, the planter class extended special privileges to poor whites in an effort to drive a wedge between them and black slaves. White settlers were allowed greater access to Native American lands. White servants were allowed to police slaves through slave patrols and militias, and barriers were created so that free labor would not be placed in competition with slave labor. These measures effectively eliminated the risk of future alliances between black slaves and poor whites. And the catalyst that really set this off was Bacon's rebellion. This was a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. So he had a lot of grievances against the colonial governments. So what he organized, actually an army of poor white, indentured servants and poor black, mixture of indentured servants and enslaved, people. And they rose up against, the colonial government at Jamestown, and actually burned down a lot of the colonial government in Jamestown, burned down a lot of the town. And it was really scared the aristocracy. They had to send a British army over from England to kind of put down this rebellion. And I think a lot of people romanticize this too as this proletarian kind of struggle, and it was, but it was also, we have to also understand that the different layers of how all this stuff works. The biggest things they wanted to do is that they were being held back from attacking native land and stealing land. That was their biggest grievance, or at least Nathan Bacon's biggest grievance, because at the time British were trying to hold them from attacking native lands, not because they cared about native people. It was more about they didn't want to fight another war, but at the same time, but yeah. But anyway, so when they finally put this rebellion down, they came up with a whole bunch of new laws to kind of really finish, seal a deal on this divide and conquer, this racial bribe. And so what they did was they passed a series of slave codes. Virginia was the first one to pass it, and every other state passed it. And this codified and solidified chattel slavery, and it solidified it as a racial system. Basically, all black people were to be enslaved, and the children of those slaves were going to be enslaved, and they're all going to be properties of Europeans. And they gave free, permission to torture, rape, and kill these people, these enslaved people as well. And even there were some free black people too at the time, but they took away a lot of their rights, segregated them, and made it pretty awful at this point to be black, even a free black person. And on the other side, they created benefits, for Europeans that are of the poor European class. And this is the first time we actually saw the words white appear in a legal document. This is the first time, because before then, you were considered Europeans, you were considered English or whatever, Spanish, you were not considered white. This is the first time that we start seeing laws passed that use the word white, and it was used as a specific, a legal classification of a privileged group of people who were, they limited citizenship. Suddenly you had to be, in order to be a citizenship, you had to be white. In order to be, a citizenship of the colonial governments, which meant, you still had you didn't have a whole lot of power, but you still had, some rights. And then the first actual uses of the word white was during a incineration. It's when black and white people mix together, that they actually had that law where any white person actually married a black person would be banished. So they started making this wedge, and all of a sudden they started seeing these white people were now uniting with the rich white people under this idea of whiteness, which was basically to be white basically meant you weren't black at this time, and black people you weren't going to be enslaved, you weren't going to be you have your rights stripped. That was what it meant to be white. And as we see later on, that didn't necessarily have to do with skin color, because a lot of people with white skin color did not get that classification for a really long time. Irish, Italians, Jewish people. So it was more about a legal status. And then we see the creation of the United States, and this is so I just watched Hamilton the other day. Now that it's streaming, and Hamilton for me is an and situation. Like, I loved it. It was so good. The music was so good. The actors were so good. And oh God, that story is just not true. We keep on selling this story about these great founding fathers who created this amazing democracy, and Alexander Hamilton was not against slavery for sure. I mean, that's a whole nother thing. I'm not going to get into it because I really like. Sometimes you have to turn your brain off and just enjoy. And I think it was legitimately okay to enjoy that. But at the same time, we have to understand that the history of this country. We created a slaveocracy. We did not create a democracy. And it's true that some people, not everyone owned slaves. A lot of the founding fathers owned slaves, but not everyone did, or enslaved people. But at the same time, we created a constitution that gave an enormous amount of power to the people that did own slaves. And that's what we really need to focus on. It's not just that not everyone owned slaves, but the fact that the people who owned slaves in our constitution had the most power in our government. And that was mainly with the 3/5 compromise. So that gave, states with a lot of enslaved people, they counted each enslaved person was counted as 3/5 of the vote. So if you had a million enslaved people, you had, 600,000 extra votes, not votes, but extra population counts, which, played into, the representation in electoral college. So the southern states, in particular, had an enormous amount of power, because it wasn't just about, white voters. It was also white voters that were using the black population to give themselves more representation, more power in the government, more choice of the leaders. Like Thomas Jefferson would not have been elected if it wasn't for the 3/5 compromise. He got his majority from the extra votes that slave owners had. So it's really important that we created this constitution to support slavery in so many different ways. We had fugitive slave clauses in it. We had all these different things. Like abolitionist William Garrison called our Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. And that's really important to understand. But at the same time, our Constitution didn't have some kind of universal standard for voting. So it's like, it basically just kicked it to the states, and which mainly, most of the states were like, you had to have property to vote, which meant you were 99% white male. There was a few states like Jersey that had women with property could vote, and I think some places where African free Africans could vote, but not many people. And that was soon officially abolished with the Naturalization Act of 1798. That's where we basically took the status of whiteness. And decided our whole nation would be for white people only. So we decided in the Naturalization Act that only citizens, and if you're citizens, you had a right to vote, own land, due process, juries, all that stuff. The only people that would get those rights from starting in 1798 would be white people. So again, white people, these were early, Western European white people. Again, Irish and all these people did not qualify for these statuses when they eventually came over. But that is the first time when we see white in a legal doc, that basically states that this is a white country. And we need to understand, because we sell this beautiful myth of just of this democracy, and we fought for freedom and stuff. We're going to talk about, actually, next month we're going to talk about some of the reasons that we actually went to, war with Britain that had nothing to do with taxes. I mean, it had more to do with preserving slavery. Like Britain was actually in the process of outlawing slaves, and a whole bunch. We'll get into that next month, but yeah. So we have to understand like this is a slaveocracy, and then this is about a country that was dedicated to for white people. And we even see it in the early census, we see, immediately we start classifying people as white people who are citizens, free people of color who weren't citizens, and then black people who are mainly enslaved. So that's kind of, we start seeing this, create our country. And there's I can move my thing. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, American notions of race are the product of racism, not the other way around. We know this because we see the formation of race in American law and policy. And then just to kind of prove how like flimsy this idea of race is, it just had such flexibility. It was crazy how certain people would with white skin would certain times would be considered white and wouldn't be. Irish, Jewish, and Italians, they were all they came on this kind of more of a second wave of immigrants, and they were definitely discriminated against. Again, they're used as they're exploited labor. But eventually, they became white, and a lot of that was because they had to drop a lot of their ethnicity, and at the same time, they had to kind of become complicit with the oppression of Black people and Indigenous people. So that was kind of like your entrance fee was basically you had to like accept, and not only accept, but help perpetuate anti-Blackness in this country to get your white card. And then Latin, like we talked, that video talked about like, Mexicans, Mexican, Americans were all times, I mean, they were white at first, and then we needed to scapegoat them and for political purposes. So they weren't white, so we could deport them. But then we needed, labor for our food systems. And all our food systems, even today, are based on the plantation model of exploited labor and exploited land. So I mean, even now, even though we got rid of slaves, and enslaved people, we still use horrific and migrant labor, and we treat them practically like slaves. And so when we need labor again, then they got the white classification, and then they're not they have their own classification now, but a lot of people are talking about like the browning of America, like supposedly in 2045. White people are going to be a minority, and a lot of, that's, yeah, I can't wait. But but a lot of people are worried that that white people aren't just going to aren't going to let that happen, and they're going to start including Latinx people back into this white category to maintain this white status. But yeah, I guess we're just going to have to see. So, and then there's the idea called hypodescendant. So that's the idea is when like a mixed race couple get, when they have a child, that child's status is automatically the lower status of the race, the couple. So, so that child is considered Black. Perfect example is like Obama. Obama had a white and Black parent. But I mean, no one ever like. He was automatically, without even thinking, he was a Black person, and that's like how, that's how this country formed right from the get-go. Was like, if you had any kind of like Black relation, in your system, then you couldn't qualify for that white status. And we see that, a lot, there was a lot of different, a lot of states had their own qualifications of what it meant to be white, and you had to, have no less than, no more than an eighth, a fourth of African ancestries. And then, Virginia and other states officially just, adopt the one drop rule, where basically like anyone who had, any kind of, Black or Native blood were considered non-white. And that, we saw that really come out with the blood quantum with Native Americans. So a lot of the U.S. government created this blood quantum system where, because a lot of, we had a lot of treaties, after we were, ethnically cleansed and did all these horrible things, and we moved all these people to these areas that had treaties, and these treaties came with obligations from our government to provide services, and so they, but they didn't want to provide services for, anyone they didn't have to. So what they would do, they created this blood quantum where basically, Indigenous people had to like prove that they had a certain amount of ancestry to qualify for these services. And that was and they specifically did this because they knew, that Native people were breeding them. They were having children with white people and black people, and they were slowly kind of like, according to this blood quantum, they were slowly wiping them, removing themselves with the idea eventually, like, government wouldn't have to pay services because no one would qualify. Even though with the actual tribes, it had nothing to do with your ancestry. It had to do, whether you're part of a tribe was more about, whether you accepted the culture and things like that. But still to this day, the American government uses this blood quantum and they only give services to Native Americans who can, prove that their ancestry. And you would see there's a lot of problems with that because a lot of Native Americans, if you had, bad record keeping, you couldn't prove your records, or if if your, ancestors, had relations with white or black people and it kind of mixed it, a lot of people are being kind of screwed out of their, or not getting their services, guaranteed. So. All right. And then, so then we had these so we had these anti-black, anti-indigenous systems, and we had all this these creation of these racial hierarchy forming. But in order to kind of justify and kind of further sell and solidify this racial hierarchy that all the people in power are trying to create, we had a whole bunch of people from the 17, 18, and 1900s, like philosophers and scientists and biologists and people in medicine and religion. It just created a whole bunch of different things, justifications for this racial hierarchy. Like Thomas Jefferson was a white supremacist, being that he considered black people to be inferior, and wrote a lot about how white people were superior to black people. Social Darwinism, this was Darwinism was like about categorizing in species and survival of the fittest and evolution, all that. Well, a bunch of racists took that and made it social Darwinism, where they start looked at all these people who had been enslaved and exploited for so long and said, well, they must just be on the bottom of the ladder. A lot of scientific racism, where people started categorizing people based on their skulls and skin colors, and trying to come up with these like labyrinth categories where white people were always on the top and black people were always on the bottom. Same with medicine. This is where we see the beginning of eugenics, which is an idea that not just like categorizing people, but we need to act and purify our society. And that started a lot of sterilization programs that we're going to talk about in other classes. And then religion as well. The Southern churches, a lot of if you wanted to be a church in the South, you basically had to scrub your Bible of anything that had to do with compassion and anti-slavery and things like that. And you had to teach only things like Mark of Cain and Curse of Ham and Romans 13, all these different things in the Bible that justified slavery or justified, people following law. If, God wanted people to follow laws and stuff like that. And it's not that churches fought that, some did, but they all got kicked out. They had to leave. I mean, and eventually they had a solid system of churches that just basically, perpetuated and justified slavery. All right, so that takes us to I just went through kind of the brief history, but now so this is a guy that does see in the white, John Biewen, I think his name is. He's going to probably summarize it really quickly, a little bit more elaborately, and kind of talk a little bit more. But this is a really great TED Talk that kind of talks a little bit about some of the things I said, but also what that means to him and how that kind of, yeah.
First of all, race is a recent invention. It's just a few hundred years old. Before that, yes, people divided themselves by religion, tribal group, language, things like that. But for most of human history, people had no notion of race. In ancient Greece, for example, and I learned this from the historian Nell Irvin Painter, the Greeks thought they were better than the other people they knew about, but not because of some idea that they were innately superior. They just thought they'd developed the most advanced culture. So they looked around at, the Ethiopians, but also the Persians and the Celts. They said, they're all kind of barbaric compared to us. Culturally, they're just not Greek. Right? And yes, in the ancient world, there was lots of slavery, but people enslaved people who didn't look like them, and they often enslaved people who did. Did you know that the English word slave is derived from the word Slav? Because Slavic people were enslaved by all kinds of folks, including Western Europeans, for centuries. Right? Slavery wasn't about race either, because no one had thought up race yet. So who did? I put that question to another leading historian, Ibram Kendi. I didn't expect he would answer the question in the form of one person's name and a date, as if we were talking about the light bulb. But he did. He said in his exhaustive research, he found what he believed to be the first articulation of racist ideas. And he named the culprit. This guy should be more famous or infamous. His name is Gomes de Zurara. Portuguese man, wrote a book in the 1450s in which he did something that no one had ever done before, according to Dr. Kendi. He lumped together all of the people of Africa, vast, diverse continent, and he described them as a distinct group, inferior and beastly. Never mind that in that pre-colonial time, some of the most sophisticated cultures in the world were in Africa. Why would this guy make this claim? Turns out it helps to follow the money. First of all, Zurara was hired to write that book by the Portuguese king. And just a few years before, slave traders, here we go, slave traders tied to the Portuguese crown had effectively pioneered the Atlantic slave trade. They were the first Europeans to sail directly to sub-Saharan Africa to kidnap and enslave African people. So it was suddenly really helpful to have a story about the inferiority of African people, to justify this new trade, to other people, to the church, to themselves. And with the stroke of a pen, Zurara invented both blackness and whiteness, because he basically created the notion of blackness through this description of Africans. And as Dr. Kendi says, blackness has no meaning without whiteness. Other European countries followed the Portuguese lead in looking to Africa for human property, free labor, and in adopting this fiction about the inferiority of African people. I found this clarifying. Racism didn't start with a misunderstanding, it started with a lie. Meanwhile, over here in colonial America, people now calling themselves white got busy taking these racist ideas and turning them into law. Laws that stripped all human rights from the people they were calling black and locking them into our particularly vicious brand of chattel slavery. And laws that gave even the poorest white people benefits, not big benefits in material terms, but the right to not be enslaved for life, the right to not have your loved ones torn from your arms and sold, and sometimes real goodies, the handouts of free land to white places like Virginia, to white people only, started long before the American Revolution and continued long after. Now, I can imagine there would be people listening to me, if they're still listening, who might be thinking, oh, come on, this is all ancient history. Why does this matter? Things have changed. Can't we just get over it and move on? Right? But I would argue, for me, certainly, learning this history has brought a real shift in the way that I understand racism today. To review, 2 quick takeaways from what I've said so far. 1, race is not a thing biologically. It's a story some people decided to tell. And 2, people told that story to justify the brutal exploitation of other human beings for profit. I didn't learn those 2 facts in school. I suspect most of us didn't. If you did, you had a special teacher. Right? But once they sink in, for one thing, it becomes clear that racism is not mainly a problem of attitudes. individual bigotry. No, it's a tool. It's a tool to divide us and to prop up systems, economic, political, and social systems that advantage some people and disadvantage others. And it's a tool to convince a lot of white folks who may or may not be getting a great deal out of our highly stratified society to support the status quo. Could be worse, at least I'm white. Once I grasped the origins of racism, I stopped being mystified by the fact that it's still with us. I guess, looking back, I thought about racism as being sort of like the flat earth, this bad, outdated thinking that will fade away on its own before long. But now this tool of whiteness is still doing the job it was invented to do. Powerful people go to work every day, leveraging and reinforcing this old weapon. In the halls of power, in some broadcast studios we could mention. And we don't need to fuss over whether these people believe what they're saying, whether they're really racist. That's not what it's about. It's about pocketbooks, power. Finally, I think the biggest lesson of all, and we talk in particular to the white folks for a minute. Once we understand that people who look like us invented the very notion of race in order to advantage themselves and us, isn't it easier to see that it's our problem to solve? It's a white people problem. I'm embarrassed to say that for a long time I thought of racism as being mainly a struggle for people of color to fight, sort of like the people on the TV screen when I was a kid. Or as if I were on the sidelines at a sports contest. On one side, people of color. On the other, those real racists, Southern sheriff, people in hoods. And I was sincerely rooting for people of color to win the struggle. But now, there are no sidelines. We're all in it. We are implicated. And if I'm not joining the struggle to dismantle a system that advantages me, I am complicit. This isn't about shame or guilt. White guilt doesn't get anything done. And honestly, I don't feel a lot of guilt. History isn't my fault or yours. What I do feel is a stronger sense of responsibility to do something.
All right. So just to answer your question, Griffin, sorry, you're saying you can't hear it. I apologize for that. I think it's working for other people. A lot of these you can probably cut and paste the title or just type in the title into YouTube and probably pull it up on your side as well, because all these are I just grabbed from YouTube. Or if not, if you can't figure it out too, I'll be recording this too as well, and so you can definitely catch the recording. But I apologize. Yeah, I don't know how to get the sound working on the side, but then so I really appreciate not only John Bwin as perspective on whiteness, but also some of the last lines was like, because we were talking about how horrible whiteness is, and at the same time, this isn't to like shame people for being white. We're not responsible for the history. We're not responsible, for what our ancestors did, but we are responsible for just recognizing the society that we were born into, and doing our part to just kind of dismantle and make this a better world. So I definitely want to let I don't want people to walk away. Sorry, I'm going to mute whoever it was, but I'm not going to. This isn't about shaming, and that's actually we don't want to shame, because at the same time that creates a lot of white guilt, and it keeps us from actually doing something. But we want to actually just acknowledge this isn't our fault. We were born into this just like everyone else, but we are responsible for helping dismantle and doing our part. So cool.